So from Stephen Hahn, MD of the FDA, these vaccines have not been rushed. Well, how can this be? The name of the program is WarpSpeed, for goodness sake. Well, firstly, no steps were left out. We're able to collapse about 4 years of preliminary regulations and research due to unnecessary bureaucratic loads and roadblocks, another 5 years due to the improved organization of the clinical trials, which were stacked one on top of each other rather than in linear sequence, and this saved at least 5 years. Also, we probably saved 4 or 5 years due to the intense pressure for agencies to cooperate rather than to compete. And this has been previously unseen. Usually vaccines take 10 or more years for approval, but because of previous mRNA vaccine work, and you see here, remember we discussed mRNA vaccines have been used for years in fighting cancer, and because of collapsing the clinical phases into parallel tracks rather than those linear tracks, we've been able to take this process from 10 years down to 10 months. This was a thorough but compressed FDA review process, and the approval process was with manifold more staff working at every level of government and the private sector, civilian and military, to develop a safe and effective vaccine. So we've seen similar efficiencies in Britain and the US during the buildup for World War II, and we've certainly acted like this was a world war in some ways, I guess. You see here Dr. Peter Hotez, who I was in a video conference webinar with last week. He's the director of the Baylor Institute for Immunization and for Viral Research, I believe. Also, that this meeting had the director of the FDA, Stephen Hahn, also director of Cyber, which is an independent vaccine research and caretaking agency that our government contracts with to make sure that vaccines in particular and other biologicals are careful, much like the medicines that you see advertised for cancer, for psoriasis, for rheumatoid arthritis, and other like diseases. That Cyber is a very careful, very independent agency, which has been kept that way for this very reason. Now, we discussed the careful nature, but the extreme intensity, the focus, and the effort of that project. And Dr. Hotez was doing work, as he mentioned, even back in 2012, and you can see his vials that he was doing coronavirus vaccine research on back in 2012. His viral vaccines were never brought to market because the SARS and the MERS epidemics were eradicated and burned out primarily in regional epidemics. So there was never a market to produce those or a worldwide necessity like we've seen with COVID-19 in this pandemic. So regarding efficacy, that means just how effective is something. How well do these vaccines work and protect you from infection? 95% protection. 19 out of 20 people who are vaccinated and get exposed to COVID did not get infection in the studies, nor should they get infections after being vaccinated twice. These studies and data have been reviewed and verified by every major World Health Organization and research body and are reported separately here by the New York Times, Washington Post. Antibody titers in the bloodstream of those vaccinated with the two-shot series stayed high, as you can see, up to 119 days, providing immunity for 4 to 6 months so far. We don't know how long because we've not seen those stage 3 clinical trial patients who received both parts of the vaccine, the 30,000 with Moderna and the 40,000 with Pfizer. We've not seen how their immune cells and their immune antibody levels produce beyond this time. But remember, because these vaccines are molecularly different, as we described in the last video, the second vaccine must be of the same type as the first to have the 95% confidence that we can be protected. And this is due to that slight spike protein segment that our immunization prepares our system to recognize and use to destroy the virus before it causes infection. Now, many have questioned if our immune response might not be better from getting the virus and becoming ill. And I know certainly for those of you that went through chickenpox parties, there's a lot of common sense to that. I used to say that about chickenpox until I saw a case of a child who got chickenpox, got a skin infection, and had to have hip surgery at 6 years of age when he would have never got such a thing if he had just had the varicella-zoster vaccine in childhood. So we think the vaccine is actually going to be better at producing protective antibodies for longer, and here's why. Convalescent serum at 30 days is lower in patients who got the infection than those who are immunized. And those infected and ill don't produce the same robust kind of effective and organized response in the lymph nodes and the spleen as those who receive this 2-dose mRNA vaccine do. To see here how very effective and necessary these lymph node germinal centers are that form kind of an immunization hierarchy and organization for producing these antibodies efficiently. There's also a much more unorganized inflammatory and dysregulated immune chemical response in patients who are infected, and many of you have heard what's been called about the cytokine storm. And that's where the immune system just goes berserk and starts producing inflammatory chemicals that inflame the lungs and many other tissues. Now, this process actually inhibits effective immunity. Therefore, we find that herd immunity might then be very difficult to obtain through natural infections. Finally, long-term B-cell memory immunity, crucial for targeted antibody production, requires these germinal centers in lymph nodes and in the spleen that getting the infection doesn't seem to be as effective at producing. So just another look at a separate study which agrees with the rest regarding the 95% effectiveness. Note that in the green that 7 days after the second dose. Now that assumes that these patients are getting the second dose, and it is in fact crucial that patients receive the second dose. So much so that you see in this graphic that I made that the immunity is nearly double with the second dose. The current date only addresses, So currently, this only addresses non-pregnant, healthy people between ages 16 and 85, including both patients who've had COVID and those who've not had COVID, of course, and that there's no suspicion that there was an asymptomatic infection. Also, these vaccines were intentionally studied in subjects from all genders, races, and genetic backgrounds. But you say, well, what about special groups, Doc? And this has been a question that a lot of female patients have asked me. And that is, remember that these drugs and vaccines can't be tested on people who might have unexpected side effects in areas that we just don't understand initially, that we must test them on safe and healthy adults first. And the first, of course, that you can imagine is pregnant women. What about pregnant women, breastfeeding mothers, those trying to get pregnant, infants and children, or those over 85 years of age? What about people who are on chemotherapy or the immunocompromised, for which COVID would be so destructive? Well, there's a physician that works for the National Health Service of Britain that was part of the European studies. His name is Dr. Karan Rajan, and he's an MD at the Imperial College of Britain. And he states the following, which I find interesting. There's no reason to expect an effect on fertility. Specific research would have been done if there were a plausible reason to expect this being a problem. He goes on to say, instead, the risk of COVID affecting your fertility is far greater. And I think that's a common sense approach. We haven't researched it yet, but research studies are going to be done soon, I'm sure. Now, there are more side effects as this mature effective immunity develops in COVID naive and COVID experienced adults are immunized, and we'll discuss this in the safety and efficacy section more specifically. So with that, we turn to safety and side effects. Now, a note of reassurance, and I want you to think with me about this. We had two companies, one in Germany and also with the cooperation from the U.S. for Pfizer, and one completely in the United States, Moderna, who began independent research. These are competing companies who did not share research information, who are trying to get to the answer first, and they arrive at the same target. They arrive at it nearly in the same time. They arrive at nearly the same way to produce the vaccine with small differences in the molecular target. They come up with the same safety and efficacy data. Now, if this occurs in those kind of situations, you can rest assured that there's nothing to be worried about here regarding collusion or some kind of conspiracy, and maybe even less than with previously developed vaccines. So a quote from Stephen Hahn, the FDA Commissioner Director and MD, and Peter Marks, MD, PhD, the Director of the Cyber Biological Lab. They say, we are committed, and this was early on in the process, we are committed to the expediting of development of COVID-19 vaccines, but not at the expense of sound science and decision making. We will not jeopardize the public's trust in our science-based independent review of these or any vaccines. There's too much at stake. Look at the vast numbers, 56 in all, of civilian and military, all branches of military, with overlapping oversight and safeguards in Operation Warp Speed. I don't worry when I know the military is involved. They have nothing to gain by immunizing our fighting men and women with dangerous or ineffective vaccines against a pandemic. This gives me great personal reassurance. This is one of the reasons that I'm volunteering to be early in the vaccine doses locally. So, to go on with discussion of safety and efficacy, not even to mention that private and public sectors were equally involved in the research, development, testing, and analysis of all these results. Also consider that over 20 countries were involved, those countries who have different political ideologies, independently involved in the same process. It would be inconceivable, if not impossible, for a vaccine to endure all the above and have a danger of ineffectiveness not to be discovered and reported when you have communist countries like China or capitalist countries like the US, socialist countries in Western Europe, people who are not our allies, different companies competing, trying to get the market with a good vaccine. So here's just a slide from the American Medical Association commenting on their review that has shown unwavering regulatory safeguards in place for COVID-19 vaccines. Also on the right, notice the independent cyber agency that I've been referring to that oversees vaccines separate from every other private, government, civilian, or military agency. Another important piece of information is a vaccine usually is tested on an average of about 21,750 subjects through phase 3 trials before it can be approved by the FDA. Combined, these two vaccines were tested in over 30,000 patients each, and because of the nearly identical target and the very similar development of these two vaccines, it is as if we've had 70,000 patient studies, more than 3 times the usual normal. Because of this, we have numbers that allow for excellent statistical and scientific analysis. And with that, we can have some confidence as to one of the major concerns, and that of potential side effects. Now, as we turn to potential side effects, this is something that caught my eye early on. Quote, up to 4.6 of those who received the vaccine report severe side effects. And that was quoted in the Wall Street Journal from their journalists who analyzed medical and scientific data. This concerned me somewhat at first, I'll be honest. That 4.6% is 1 in 20. Now, I began to dig more deeply to make sure I understood what those numbers were. And here's a graphic that I synthesized from these more complex data in a much more tedious chart, simplifying redundant information and just getting it down to what was practical. Note that there were no severe side effects after the first dose in the Moderna vaccine or the Pfizer vaccines that I could find. And after the second dose in the Pfizer study, there were severe effects or severe side effects in the great minority in all of those symptoms except pain at the injection site and fatigue. So you see how those numbers stack up versus 100%. Looked at another way, I'll share another graphic that I created from the data from the largest symptom report that I could find from these scientists quoted by the Wall Street Journal, stating what they call severe side effects. So read with me. Arm pain in 2.7% after the first dose. Muscle pain, joint pain, and headache after the second dose. And these were all thankfully less than 10%. And then at the bottom right, you'll see that one of the physicians stated, we're not really anticipating we will have a lot of people who will be unable to work because of the vaccine. Now, I don't know about you folks, but when you've been injected with one of these, like I was in grade school before, and all of those of us who were in grade school before 1980, and you've got one of these to show for it, and those symptoms above, they don't look so bad to me for 1 or 2 days, with the majority not expected to even miss work over their symptoms. I will take a 10% chance of severe symptoms, so-called, such as arm pain, fever, and fatigue, for a few days every time versus contracting and spreading COVID. And I don't know about you, but that's kind of what I expect from each flu vaccine that I get. I've been down for half a day or a day with flu vaccine with fatigue, malaise, arm pain, muscle aches, headache, diarrhea, nausea. So this didn't seem like it was that severe to me once I dug into the data, and hopefully that helps you. Now, also most reassuringly, 4 to 7 months after the series of injections in these 70,000 subjects, I could not find a single case of Guillain-Barré syndrome, death, or seizures, or even hospitalizations, other than the 2 people in the UK who were reported to have anaphylaxis or severe allergic reactions. And these two folks were toting EpiPens because they were anaphylactic to so many other things. This was part of the basic warning, and these patients were told that they might have anaphylaxis. You might have heard that there were 4 cases of Bell's palsy in that 40 to 70,000 people. But this is exactly the number of cases of Bell's palsy that we expect to see in 70,000 people in the general public who've had no immunizations. One disturbing but representative piece of social media disinformation regards this report that there were 6 deaths in the late stage of the trials of Pfizer's vaccine. There were 6 deaths in stage 3 trials at Pfizer, but 4 of the 6 patients were receiving placebo, and the 2 deaths in the patients who were vaccinated had no connection to vaccination or immunity. Now think of the death rate in the general population of approximately 1.1%, whether it's in Arkansas, the United States as a whole, Western Europe. So in a study of 40,000 patients in a stage that lasts at least 2 months, the expected number of deaths would be 73 in any group of people in the general population, whether they've been immunized or not. So Pfizer lost a total of 6 people. That's less than 1/10 of those that the general population would have been expected to lose during the same period of time. Sounds like to me it's safer to get the vaccine than to not get the vaccine. And one personal story, this teleconference that I was a part of, Walter Isaacson spoke as a result of this related to his experience as a COVID vaccine candidate. He was in the study. Now, you may know Walter Isaacson from his great biographies of Ben Franklin, Stephen Jobs, and others. And he was a member of the Pfizer study at Ochsner Medical Center in New Orleans. He had an interesting quote saying, "Folks, nothing in life is without risk." I totally agree. Now for a little fun fact time for those who may have been influenced by Facebook RN or Google MD. I've run across this claim, which is a sad and a harmful hoax. Quote, "They want to produce genetically modified humans with the COVID-19 vaccine." You'll see that on a website and Facebook post from a Dr. Andrew Kaufman. So let's return to how we have fun with basic science and how helpful it can be. Remember how on the right, mRNA vaccines work within cells outside of the nucleus in what we call the extranuclear part of the cell with its little transcribing machinery and it transcribing proteins. What messenger RNA does billions of times each second in cells in our body just since I've said that sentence. So how could a messenger, that's a messenger usually sent out of the nucleus and not able to get back in, how is that going to modify the genes in the nucleus of our cells? Remember the FDA doctor's quote, "No vaccine products enter the nucleus of the cell." Remember the 70,000 test subjects that have complained of no long-term sequelae in less than these 7 months, and none of whom turned into zombies. Now look on the right. Do you know what vaccine does enter the nucleus of our cells? Every flu vaccine and almost all vaccines that you or your kids have ever had. Have you ever heard of anyone claim that your baby or grandchild getting their DPT or their MMR vaccine is going to be a genetically modified human? This is one reason why the BBC recently stated that Facebook, quote, "is a danger to public health." But folks, do you know what actually does modify your genes through a process called epigenetics? And this is something I'm very passionate about with my own patients and in my own life. What does modify our genes through effects above the genetic level is a negative, distrustful, conspiracy thinking mindset and the unnecessary stress and lack of rest that they cause, along with the negative consequences of poor decisions for people that don't have enough information or are caught up in these kind of conspiracy theories and hoaxes. Did you know that many identical twins, for example, don't look alike after they pass the teenage years? How could that be? They're clones of each other. Well, in this little 1-minute clip, which is one of my favorites, I'll show you how epigenetics work. This shows activated and inactivated genes in the cells of different tissues in our body. For example, some tissues in the pancreas that produce insulin, some in our spleen and lymph nodes that produce immunity, some in our lungs or other parts of our body, such as our glands, that suppress tumor formation. And the activation or inactivation of these genes is due to different life circumstances, different diets, lifestyles, exercise patterns, body fat percentage, being raised in different kinds of households in different environments with different kind of stress and conflict. Even the way we think and how we feel about our thoughts changes the genes which are either turned off or turned on and can be either beneficial or harmful. These, for example, just as I showed you, could produce diabetes, autoimmune diseases, risk for Alzheimer's disease, heart attacks, or even cancer. So when identical twins are stressed more or less in life, have a poor diet, bad habits, different stressors or traumas, it affects which genes are expressed. And you see here how many of the twins at this long-term identical twin study at King's College London don't even look alike. Many aren't even the same height. Now here's an extreme example in two identical twin sisters. This is called behavioral epigenetics, and it is fascinating. And it worries me, honestly, as a physician who cares for patients, how so many who focus so much on the fearful and negative without good information do harm to themselves. And you may say, can we hear more, Mr. Science? Maybe later. I've kept these nice people long enough. And we'll finish with our last segment, part 3, regarding the vaccine rollout and availability, as well as privacy and anonymity issues coming up soon. Thank you so much for your attention. I'll be back with you shortly.